Well, welcome back. I hope that most of you have already caught segment one of this interview with Mike Giresi from Molex. Mike is going to continue here with us through this second segment, and bear in mind, there's a third one afterwards, so don't miss that. All right, so segment two, here we go, Mike. This is going to be focused on the key process and data improvements that were identified as cornerstones of the transformation, the digital transformation of the product lifecycle. So let's just jump right in and ask you if you could maybe just highlight for us some of the process and the data improvements that ignite, customer advantage in the way to business and financial ROI.
Well, it's really interesting, Derek. We mentioned that Molex is an 80-year-old company that grew up in lots of different configurations, if you will. And I think the company had this fierce entrepreneurship at a local level, which enabled a lot of creative capability within specific locations and specific business units, but did not lend itself to scaling those types of enablements. And what I mean by that is, we may have many different ways of doing a similar capability, like labeling, for example, where there's no real inherent advantage of having lots of different labeling solutions. We just need to be able to label as a capability. But because of how we grew up, and again, this is part of the reason why the company was so successful early on, those decision rights were at pretty disparate locations across the enterprise. And you might not be surprised to know that we really didn't have one single way of operating as a company. So when you think about developing product and then bringing that product through the various stages of innovation to make it a real product, to then fulfill and commercialize and ultimately service and support, there wasn't a single way to do that. There were lots of different ways to do it. And what we realized pretty early on was that if we just implemented new technology, all we really be doing is creating a lot of new customized ways of working that would not scale, would not provide us a competitive advantage, and unfortunately would probably get us to the wrong answer faster, which wasn't what we were trying to achieve. So we had to step back and start thinking about, well, how do we want to operate? What's really complementary and kind of normalized across the various divisions and BUs, and what needs to be unique? Because there are definitely some things about what we do and how we do it in terms of the verticals that we compete, where those customers just operate differently. The actual methodology might not be so different in terms of how you go from inception of idea through the commercialization aspect, but how you interact with that customer is very, very different. So what we decided is that we have to start with just, quite frankly, an operating model. If we don't have a way of working, it's going to be really hard for us to bring these capabilities to the market in a differentiated way. And of course, in complementary to that, if you will, and that's probably the wrong word because it's not really a compliment, was the fact that data grew up the same way. So from an operating process perspective, you had lots of differentiation where value wasn't being created. You had lots of different ways that data was being created and managed or not managed. So we had to set out with a new way of thinking about data from an enterprise asset perspective. Like, in other words, what we actually enter and create in terms of how we service and enable the customer directly correlates to the quality of the information which we're using. So if we want to be able to provide better transparency to lead times, we want to ensure that our forecasts are effectively aligned with our customers and that our schedules around the manufacturing of that forecast is aligned to that outcome. We have to be working off information that has efficacy, like it's actually actionable. So we had to go through a pretty serious education process on what does it mean to really have a data governance program, not bureaucratically, more action-oriented, owned within our businesses. Because quite frankly, it's not a technology ownership thing. It really comes down to how we think about the value of that data in the consequence of the customer, and then the processes that consume that data. Are we really thinking about those processes through the lens of the employee in support of the customer? Like, in other words, if you're sitting in customer service you're kind of on the front line. You're interacting with the customer on a pretty consistent basis. You know what the customer is feeling good about and what they're not feeling so good about. Well, how do we take that feedback loop and start to incorporate that into the rest of the operating model? Because quite honestly, that outcome is being impacted by a plant, most likely in Asia, on a plant floor from someone who has they have no idea how their behavior is actually driving progress or the lack of progress through the operating model to the customer. So we've had to really change our mental models in terms of how we think about operating model as an asset, data as the enabler to that asset, and breaking down some of the cultural challenges, quite honestly, that existed so people could think about it that way. We have a long way to go, by the way. We're nowhere perfect on this, but I feel really good about the progress that we've made, particularly in the supply chain and some of the material master activity that we've undertaken. We're getting much better at being able to understand where something is in our pipeline, how we can action it to bring it forward more effectively. I mean, I'm sure everyone who is listening to this is aware of the supply chain challenges that have existed over the past 2.5 years and will continue to exist going forward. Many of our customers are directly impacted by the processor scarcity issue. So our ability to help them solve and look for different ways of creating outcomes is really important. Our processes had to change to enable that because we weren't designed to do that going into COVID. So I will tell you that I think there's been an exceptional amount of time spent on the architecture of the business, how employees work and come together and complement each other, and the data required to do that. But it's never over, Derek. It's a journey, and we're learning as we go forward. And some of the assumptions we had, particularly around global sales and operational planning, were just not well thought out. Our perspective was not grounded in the reality of what the customer needed. So we had to change that. And we're continuing to experience situations, as such.
Yeah, I think it's so important what you said, the the whole aspect of taking process and data together. If we cast our minds back, a couple decades, people were talking about process improvement, there's all the big focus on process. And that's cool. Yeah, we want to improve our processes, but we don't think about it with the data as well. The data, the analytics, the process, all being really very tightly bound together and really complementary to each other's success.
That's
and
right.
The flip side, failure. If the data is lousy, the processes are not going to improve terribly well, and vice versa. So I love the approach that you guys have taken, the way that you've outlined it for us, Mike. I'll get it.
Derek, I think it's just based on prior experiences, quite frankly. I mean,
yeah.
A lot of these programs do not materialize in terms of the benefit that people believe they should realize. And there's a reason. I see the stats like, 85% or 80% of these programs fail. Well, I mean, failure is such a strong word. I mean, did they not exceed expectations, or did they come close to providing some improvement, maybe not all the improvement? One of the things that we had to adopt with the team, Derek, and this is really important, 5% better is better, 10% better is better. And you're not going to get to like double, 3 times, 5 times results without getting to 5, 10, 15, 20 first. And the amount of work to get to that 5, 10, 15 sometimes is harder and takes longer than it does to get to the 2, 3, 4 times results. But you have to start somewhere. And I think showing quick wins is really important, but you also have to have the right team and the right talent working this every single day to help connect people to what success looks like. Our data program, like I'm not sure if I mentioned this, when I joined, there really wasn't a data team. There were some people working in data, throughout the organization, but there was no data services, enterprise data capability that existed. We had to build that. And those resources are pretty scarce and they're hard to find. So we had to be super creative in terms of how we went from point 0 forward. I'm proud to say we've built a pretty capable team, and I think the team's adding a ton of value, but it's not without risk. There's a lot of attrition challenges. There's always somebody else who is willing to, quite frankly, pay more for a resource, particularly now. So we really have to be very grounded and intellectually, humble about what we're trying to do here, and really be thoughtful around the size of the change. The data piece, though, what we've been able to do about embedding data principles with leadership and starting to behave to those capabilities, I think is going to position Molex for success for many years forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to your point, becoming data-driven is not a switch that you just flick on and off. It's like it truly is an incremental growth kind of a journey that one takes, and certainly not to despise the day of small beginnings. Basically you got to start somewhere, and the more that you're into the cycle, as you've alluded to, the more the momentum kind of starts picking it up and carrying it forward, and then you can get some of those bigger wins.
Right.
But I think it's so important for people, as you've highlighted here, not to talk about failures, because it's such a strong term, and it makes people run away, and being realistic as well. So great perspectives. Thanks for painting that picture for us. Now, as we wind up on this second segment here and get ready to jump into the third, I just want to remind the audience, pick up all three of the segments, because you're gonna really want to understand the whole context of this discussion, which I think is really valuable. So in our next segment, we'll be talking specifically about organizational change management, and so be sure to watch out for that one, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.